Andrew Sullivan, welcome to the Realignment.
Thank you so much, Sagar. It's very nice to be here. I'm sorry it's taken me such a long time to get to this.
Well, it's the advantage of Zoom. We basically could book infinite people. I sort of think about if this were in person, it actually would be a disaster booking wise, but we could basically make anything work nowadays.
Yeah, that's right. Nobody has an excuse, and I hound them relentlessly until they agree to, which all of our guests can attribute to. Andrew, I want to start off with a question that we've kind of been asking everyone, which is, what is your general reaction to the election outcome, to the subsequent fallout? Just how has it changed and updated maybe your thinking, some of the longtime theses that you had about American politics? I just want to tee you up, and what's in your head right now?
Well, it was a fascinating election, I think, the more you look at it. Really interesting. If you consider, the narrative, the mainstream narrative of the last 4 years is that we've been undergoing a form of intensified white supremacy in which all the usual victim groups have been brutally oppressed and are about to fight back along with women, African Americans, every single minority, all of the immigrants. It's going to be a great tidal wave of resistance, and it just didn't happen. Mm-hmm. That essentially what we saw was, if anything, a slight depolarization racially along a whole bunch of different communities. Definitely more Latinos voted Republican. It looks as if more gays did for some reason. There seems to be a big increase also in Asian American support. And what was particularly encouraging is that Joe Biden won because of white voters, generally speaking, quite upscale white voters who decided that they couldn't take Trump anymore. So you had what, for me, if I'm being really selfish about this, was an almost perfect result. We got rid of the absolutely complete nutcase at the center of our lives, this grotesque distorter of everything. But we've basically asked for sort of the status quo in a way, except for Trump. So that's sort of what I get from it. I'm really fascinated by the huge turnout for Trump and for the GOP, mm-hmm. which was really also not totally expected, and which the polling was absolutely pathetic at detecting. I mean, I was surprised. I thought it would be a bigger Democratic swing, to be honest with you. Certainly, if you were going to get that kind of swing for Biden, you would expect it to be down ballot, but it wasn't. And I have all sorts of ideas, and we're going to have a long-running debate about why that is, what messages worked and what didn't. I have to say, I feel a little vindicated in as much as the world is not as left-wing as people in our business were told it was.
Right.
And the extraordinary fervor of the summer and fall around these issues of identity and of quote-unquote white supremacy are just essentially revealed in many ways as a kind of media millennial fixation that did not actually really tell us that much about what was happening in America. And so I think it also revealed, and I said this in my latest column, that their narrative is just wrong. It's empirically not making sense. It does not capture the extraordinary complexity within these minority groups. It doesn't capture the variety of opinion within them. It doesn't capture anything that one might have as an individual's views on various policy issues. It's defining people entirely by the color of their skin or their background. It's not telling you anything. It's obscuring more than it's illuminating. Now, it's true, and one shouldn't forget that nonetheless, the Democrats really are much more popular with minority groups than the Republicans.
Right.
And I think that's, one should not ignore that. But that after 4 years of this polarization, it would jumble up a little bit. That's really interesting. And it suggests that sometimes the elites especially are living in a world that doesn't really exist.
So you're doing a great job of making the case, an empirically true case against sort of the left-wing elite sort of consensus over the past 4 years. But I want to sort of engage with the right-wing, very online sort of discourse, which is the sort of the exact opposite, which is saying that the left is dominated by these identity groups. They're dominated by woke activists. And despite Joe Biden's supposed moderation, a victory for him would represent the domination by these groups in the administrative state. And this is something that really fueled a lot of right-wing opposition to Joe Biden, despite the various arguments against Trump. So I want you to engage with that narrative. What do you think about it? I'm sure you were thinking about it as you came into this.
Yeah, well, obviously, since that has been one of the, my major worries over the last few years, that we've been regressing away from what I think of a healthy multiracial and multicultural democracy. We've been regressing into these identities. And I do, and also within this ideology, there's a really very fundamental attack on liberal principles, by which I mean classical liberal principles, the basis of the West, the notion of reason and of deliberation and of free societies and of limited government. Critical theory really despises all of those as masks for racial violence and oppression, and in themselves are lies, according to them. So I'm obviously concerned, and it made this choice for me to vote for Biden and then vote for non-lefties down the ballot, which is what I did, insofar as we can get a non-lefty in Washington, D.C., which is pretty close to possible. But I did my best. Yes, it's a problem. Politics is not about the perfect choice. It's always about some awful, imperfect choice. And my view was that the threat of wokeness was very real, but the immediate emergency is a president at war with our entire liberal democratic system and fundamentally dismantling it or attempting to dismantle it in the pursuit of his own ego. And that's hugely dangerous. He is hugely incompetent. And so I temporarily put that ahead of my worry about wokeness. I do not have confidence that Biden is going to resist it. To be honest with you, don't think there's going to be a crusade. And if you don't resist it, it takes over. There's no question. It's the default now. These people are in control of all these institutions and the Democratic Party. So we will see. One thing at a time. And it doesn't stop you from keeping up criticism of this stuff and attempting to expose it and to explain why you think it's ill-judged. But I'm not gonna say this is the perfect thing. I mean, it's not. We're not. It's a mixed thing. It's something that inevitably one does with a certain amount of churn in your stomach. And to watch some of these people who are going to come in, especially domestically, it's nerve-wracking.
So quick follow-up on this. A big debate that we've sort of been having, and I look of as indicative of how you think about these things, is I think that in many ways, Donald Trump fueled wokeness in many ways, because what Donald Trump became is this figure that was so polarizing that it gave wokeness the ability to capture different institutions, because those institutions were seen as oppositional to Trump. But the people who argue against me then say that actually, if we look back to 2013, 2014, the forces of wokeness were actually rising already. So this is something that would have existed with or without Trump, with or without his various sort of kicking the beehive. How do you think about that debate?
I think you're both right. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, yes, there's no question that somewhere around 2013, 14, 15, that's when this seemed to start to really take off, especially on campus. That's when we begin to see this insanity. This is what also Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt also noted. And certainly I noted too, although it was weird. I was kind of caught blindsided this because I quit the blog, The Dish, in 2015 and took a year off. And so it was only coming back into that later that I realized, holy fuck, who are these people? And why are they such assholes? That was my first question. Why are these people so horrible personally? I mean, the sheer level of personal invective and hatred that was coming at me, even though I've, if you go back over in my career, this is not the first time I've been the subject of massive opprobrium from the left or the right for that matter, but mainly from the left. But this stuff was a whole new order of hatred. It was as if I was suddenly a Confederate soldier. I was suddenly, a member of the KKK. I was this unbelievably offensive and racist and disgusting human being. And I'm like, well, I'm still the same person. What the hell happened here? And so I do think it happened then. It's also true, however, that Trump was their wet dream. I mean, this is the caricature of their entire caricature of America. And let's face it, they're not wrong about certain aspects of America. This is important to recognize. There is a strain of this within America. It's just not defining of America, but it is a strain within it. And Trump is a particularly hideously awful representation of that strain, with a whole bunch of other stuff going on. New York, for example, which is not classically an urban situation, which is not classically where sort of this ugliness comes from. And I don't think he's ugly in that deep sense. I don't think he's a neo-Nazi. I don't think that that he's as bad quite as they say he is. I just think was such an easy target. He's the kind of political opponent you dream of, especially if you're trying to create this narrative.
Mm-hmm. I guess.
Yeah. So we'll see. Look, we'll see. I think they're still they've gained strength. Last summer, they particularly that was the moment when they seized most of these institutions and insisted that they be obeyed. And that was a moment. I think the defenestration of James Bennett at the Times was just a fascinating battle in a war. And it was a decisive win on their part. But the American public has told us in pretty clear terms, with the massive turnout, we don't want a revolution. We don't.
Yeah, and I think this is where the big question comes into mind for me, because I look at it as like multifaceted, which is that there's no question, and you're acknowledging this, which is that on an elite level, the revolution is over. Like, I think it's done. I think it's over. I think it will be with us for some time to come. And that's going to manifest itself in some very interesting ways in a Biden bureaucracy. And so as somebody who, voted for Biden and you kind of, I think, probably made the best case to the extent that there is one during the election, I want to talk about what good Biden looks like and bad Biden looks like in your view, right? So like, obviously bad Biden would include wokeism, but what does a good Biden do to stave off the reemergence of what, you described Trump as this uniquely kind of terrible figure? And, my meta question within that is really this, which is that, is it Trump that's so bad? Or is it, 40 years of governance as typified by Biden and by many of the people? I mean, we're getting many of the people he's picking for his cabinet positions and more, who created a situation where political norms were so bad that even with no, economic message, nothing, 71 million Americans raised their middle finger to the elite of this country. And they said, fuck you, basically, for Trump. And I just, how do you grapple with that question? And how might the Biden that you want to see do that while he's in office?
Well, I am not that confident that Biden has the energy and dynamism to really take the fight. Even if he wanted to. See, Biden
right.
is the trouble with Biden, I would say, is he's a sentimentalist. And he's corny. And so he will interpret critical race theory as, oh no, they're just trying to make people feel at home in the workplace, that we're just trying to avoid unnecessary offense. Well, everybody wants to avoid unnecessary offense. If this were simply some, pep talks about, don't say that, try not to say that, this sounds weird to people. Can you realize that? Or don't you see that that's kind of a little offensive?
Right.
I think most people are very open to that and don't want to offend people, but that's not what critical race theory is. That's what he thinks it is. He thinks that critical gender theory and critical queer theory means just being nice to young trans people who are dealing with unbelievably difficult stresses and strains within their own psyche about who they are, as opposed to abolishing the category of sex within civil rights law, which has any number of other consequences. He's just soft-headed on this stuff, and I think his instinct has been to just completely cave to it. So we'll see. The congressional result means that he's going to have a hard time doing a lot of that, except administratively. But even administratively, stuff can be stopped in the courts if necessary. And I think one of the small reassurances, weirdly, is that Trump has shifted the courts in a way that might help resist some of this cray-cray coming down the line, because the courts will be the ultimate defense against it. So the attack on the First Amendment is going to be, eventually going to have to be sorted out in the courts. The question of active race discrimination by the government will be sorted out by the courts. Although it was also fascinating that California, the most left-wing state in the country, not overwhelmingly, but decisively defeated the affirmative action, the attempt to reinstate the right of government to discriminate on the basis of race, which is hugely encouraging. It shows that really people don't want this. They don't want people selected for their positions on the basis of their race or their identity. They want them on the basis of their ability and their individuality. That's the American way. So, but I'm not going to say I think Biden's going to really be a hero here. I don't think he is. I think he was the least worst option. Mm-hmm. And certainly in the foreign policy stuff, Jesus, Antony Blinken. I mean, seriously.
Actually, Andrew, as you and I are talking, somebody just sent this to me. John Kerry is also going to be part of this administration. So John Kerry, Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan. I mean, it's basically an entire Obama, the Hillary Obama list.
But no, it's worse. It's worse than Obama. It's much worse, because Obama really was a non-interventionist. He didn't. True. He did have some of these liberal internationalists, but he was essentially a realist in foreign policy. I mean, he's not. I mean, apart from Libya, which was awful and dumb, but Blinken was pro the Iraq War, pro Libya. He's the classic, old school, neo-lib, neocon, blob consensus. And for him, the saddest day on earth would be if we removed troops from Afghanistan. We wouldn't recover from it. That's who we've got. And, it's not exactly a sign that Biden understands what you were saying, understands the middle finger.
Yes.
It suggests he doesn't understand the middle finger, or if he does, it's not going to translate into some kind of dramatic shift in personnel for his administration. I mean, I winced at Blinken, but what are we going to do?
Yeah.
So let's talk about the middle finger, though, because I think the middle finger is probably the most misunderstood example in American politics. Sagar and I have this debate. Was 2016 a overturning of the neoliberal consensus over the past 40 years? Or was it the fact that Hillary Clinton was the worst presidential nominee in modern American history? Is it a middle finger when Democrats win popular votes 7 out of 8 elections over a course of this history? What do these terms sort of mean? I'm not trying to put myself down on either side of those debates here, because there's a lot of, it's like you've sort of been pushing this episode, the idea that there's truth to both sides of it, but how do you navigate that fact?
Well, I'm saying the vast majority of the truth is actually on one side. I'm just saying that I think it's important to understand where both feelings are coming from, because without that, we can't actually engage one another. And I do think that what Trump has done has taken things up to such an emotional level and a psychologically fight or flight level which is the only place he's comfortable, that he's made it impossible for us to disentangle and talk about what we actually might want to do. My main hope for Biden is that it will, I mean, the thing about Blinken, for example, is that the first thing when you read those pieces is about a third of the way through, you're like, I don't want to read any more of this. You know, it's like the good old days when you read the paper every morning and were half bored after the first third of a New York Times piece about another Obama official. It's like, Jesus Christ, here we go again. And so that's what I hope, that by dialing down some of the emotional rhetoric, by actually cooling the atmosphere a little bit, that we might, through that process, begin to think a little bit more practically about the compromises that, as a whole, we need to make. And we do need to make compromise. We do need to move forward. And the problem with this polarization is it prevents us from grappling practically with problems. We look at the COVID thing. I mean, it's not insane that there should be politics over the COVID regulations. Of course there should be. When you're shutting down a society, there should be a very healthy debate about this. And I'm all in favor of the skepticism of the lockdowns to continue so that we as a society can sense where the trade-off is best made. You know, and that's the truth. We have a trade-off here. We have an economy and we have a healthcare. We have our health. And those things are actually at some point in conflict. And we have to resolve that. We need to do it empirically. We need to do it by being pretty calm about this. It's not, but so maybe, I mean, obviously Trump is the worst possible polarizer on this stuff. Obviously can't personally wear a mask. I mean, it'd be fascinating to think psychologically why he can't wear a mask, why that.
When he's a germaphobe, right? There's actually a bunch of stuff going on there. Weird.
Well, I know I don't know whether you saw, I wrote this piece in The Spectator in London saying, how on earth does I mean, here is this germaphobe, first of all, who washes his hands, won't shake hands with anybody. He's been completely manic about this his whole life, right? And he's obviously an authoritarian instinctively. So along comes the fucking virus that just, here is his fucking chance. First of all, wrap yourself in sporting clothes and masks and bubble wrap or whatever, and then order people around. But no, actually what happens is he doesn't give a shit. He wants it to go away because he really wants the economic growth. And so he's psychologically so fucked up. He thinks, oh, well, it'll go away, it'll go away, it'll go away. I don't have to worry about this. It's the mentality of like my dad used to have. I mean, we all know this. I mean, we call it toxic masculinity, but that's a stupid term. It's just men being dumb every now and again.
I have grappled with this question for a long time, Andrew. I've basically come down to the same thing you have and had to go through several acceptances of grief and depression till.
You didn't like wearing a mask?
No. I was saying with Trump, I was just like, why? Like, why? Why did it have to be this way? I was like, dude, you had everything. I mean, the whole.
Imagine he comes in, he says, let's do a massive infrastructure package.
Yeah, I know. He would have won by 65 points or something like that. You know, it's maddening.
If he'd actually got an immigration bill that really had, he was very close to it, for fuck's sake.
Yeah.
If they hadn't insisted on packaging the whole thing together with lowering legal immigration, they could have gotten a huge amount done. I think in some ways the people who should be maddest at Trump are those that actually kind of understand why that set of policies makes a certain amount of sense right now.
Well, I count myself in one of them.
For all her cray-cray, she's incredibly smart, but she's been incredibly passionate about this, which is what they should be. The base of the Republican Party, insofar as they supported Trumpism, should be furious with this guy.
But this is the problem, though. The subtext of our entire conversation, and this is what the debate is, and this is something I've become much more depressed on, is the idea that actually the base probably wasn't in it for serious immigration policy. The base actually wasn't in it for a serious infrastructure bill. The base was really in it for a toxic That's where toxic, I think, is actually about a toxic culture war. What's the explanation for Trump's inability to seize China sending a virus over to the US when he has, authoritarian instincts, and there's the germophobia, the culture war, the toxic sort of, I don't know if you saw this going around Twitter, Andrew, but Ted Cruz back in July was talking about how, oh, you guys just wait and see. The week after the election, the Democrat media is going to stop talking about COVID and it's all going to go away. It hasn't gone away. It obviously hasn't gone away. And that was him letting the culture war aspect of this rot his brain. So taking a chance to step down from that is something that's incredibly important.
Yes, it is. And Biden's, I have to say, if you look at the Biden campaign, it was an extremely effective one because we didn't see much of him. And, he's I don't know about you, but I like the guy. He's a totally. I know that guy. He's a nice guy. He's a good guy.
Yeah, he's nice. Right.
He's your old Irish uncle at Thanksgiving who goes off a bit, but he's pot of gold. All the rest of it, But his promise was boredom. His promise, and he presented himself as like normalcy, that we're just gonna go back to normalcy. He didn't really, yes, he put out these programs that he wants to beat COVID. Well, who the fuck doesn't?
And you'd be surprised.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Yeah. You're on too much Twitter.
Maybe.
Most people want this to go away.
Yeah.
I certainly do. I'm sick to death of this. Jesus, it's going to drive me up the cray-cray in the end. You're probably the only people I'm going to talk to today. It's awful. My dog is looking at me like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Leave me alone. Aren't you supposed to leave for a while and come back? Give me some time. And no, it's been a great epidemic for dogs. Anyway, I'm off track now.
No.
No, I think Biden's promise is tedium, and we will see. The other thing we're looking at right now, and you see this with the Sidney Powell.
Yeah.
I'm
no
sorry.
words.
This is, or Giuliani, that's going to go down in history. That dye running down his face as he talks about this kind of massive conspiracy. But this is embarrassing. It's humiliating as a country. It is banana republic behavior, and it's a terrible. And what we are seeing is, I was looking couldn't help, but there's a thing we used to call hathos at the dish, which is this absolute attraction to things that repel you, and it's sort of a hate read or hate. Reading Dinesh D'Souza's timeline and his commenters, and it really does, when you read it, it really does read like people in a cult finally sort of beginning to question, why would he do that? Why would he fire her? She's a great hero. How could he? You can hear in certain tweets a whole group of people beginning to grapple with the things that people who lead cults grapple with.
Yeah, something that really bothered me. There's a viral clip going around, and it was a guy who called in Rush Limbaugh's show, and he was like in tears, right? He was like, I would die for Trump. He's like, these GOP people are not stepping up for him. And I realized, I'm like, this poor man, believes in Trump, and he believes this Sidney Powell. This is what he was talking about, Sidney Powell stuff. And I'm like, this is who it's a real disservice to. Trump stood up for him in a way that he'd never felt like his entire life. And he's basically being gaslit, and to the point where he's crying on national radio to this point. And so I completely agree with you. When in terms of the best case for Biden, it's returning to normal. The real question is, you said something important. You said we got to make some compromises. What does that compromise environment look like? Because what I'm most worried about is that the Biden people and all this, I think this is probably going to happen given the cabinet choices and all that, is there's going to be this triumphalist attitude where they're like, no, actually, we don't need to make any compromises on the reasons why Trump was even elected in 2016 in the first, or got all these tens of millions of votes in 2020 in the first place. And they're just going to go full bore without compromise. But what compromises should they make if they wanted in order to actually live in a less depoliticized country?
I hate to say this, but infrastructure is a great diffuser.
Yeah, I agree with you, actually.
I mean, we need it desperately. Interest rates are really low. You can borrow money to do this. I think we do need a proper stimulus to get us through the last part of this epidemic. I think that's obviously a place where you can compromise. And I think that should be the first priority of a stimulus which includes some kind of infrastructure. Now, the question is, of course, if McConnell is interested in playing at all. I hope to God he is. I just hope to God they are.
I don't think so.
They should. Let's face it.
Oh, I mean, there's no argument. But I'm just telling you, I don't think so.
I know, but let us. I know. But I keep coming back to them. Come back to this for a decade now. Yeah. We've got to. We have to come to we have to deal with immigration somehow at some point. Mm-hmm. This is intolerable. This is crazy that we have this level of illegal immigration, this number of people who are here without proper legal permission to be here. That we are obviously looking forward have a whole new dynamic in immigration where the mass migration north is going to happen with climate change, and most of the West has got to begin to understand what's going on here. And the assertion of national identity and the protection of national borders is going to be very important. And I wish, Biden showed any sense of that, but he's on immigration, he's just completely caved to the left, and in a way that Obama, to his credit, didn't.
Yeah, I actually think that might be one of the biggest problems of his presidency, that he's underestimating. I mean, if he follows through with this immigration deportation moratorium and, basically invites the same Central American crisis we saw in 2014, 2015, we are not going to, I think that would actually, this is what we were talking about here about bad normal. That will ratchet up the politics to like 20. And we haven't seen that in a long time. And like you said, Obama actually, he still did DACA, but like he held the line to a certain respect on catch and release. And what Biden is proposing is, as a quasi-open border.
Okay, well, this is where I'm going to jump in and play the neoliberal explainer. It's like, come on, man. I think that's a bit hyperbolic. They're talking about a moratorium during the COVID pandemic. ICE basically already isn't doing anything. This is just why it's difficult to have a conversation about this, because I think that's sort of just hyperbolic to frame the issue that way.
I'll defend it because, look, if you have a deportation moratorium that goes on for a long time, and you have, you have an invitation at the border through catch and release with removing remain in Mexico, then you have essentially an immigration system where nobody is allowed to leave or to be expelled as long as they claim asylum, which is what they were all doing before the Remain in Mexico policy came into place under the Trump administration. And that actually is a run on the border, and it means that there is no legal process in order to remove somebody who is here, as even if they dubiously claim asylum. Andrew, what do you think?
Well, the data shows that of the people who have been adjudicated ineligible to stay, in other words, people who are strictly speaking deportable, or those who don't show up for their hearings for some reason, or who are denied asylum and then walk out of the court and no one ever sees them ever again. 2% annually of the illegal population is actually physically deported, which is like, which is a sinking ship where you're throwing out basically a teacup of water as the thing floods in. That's my bottom line, really. And now, look, my instincts are all pro-immigrant, obviously. I mean,
hopefully, given
Yeah, I mean,
your
look,
background.
my parents are immigrants. Like, I get it, but I'm also from Texas. Like, I know what this means, right? Like,
I had to go through unbelievable shit. I mean,
yeah.
it's one day I'm going to tell the story, but it was entirely punitive. It was unfair. It was about my being HIV positive. It was a brutal experience of constant insecurity, not only about my future health, but where I was going to live next year. And whenever I talk about this experience with lefties, they're like, "Oh, fuck you, you fucking privileged asshole." And fine, okay, I am definitely, in the sense of I got my shit together and one of those, hyper motivated immigrants and did have lawyers and could pay for it and did all the rest of it. Sure. But I'm not, my sympathy is with people who have massively insecure lives, who don't know if they're going to be in the same place in the future, whose children might have insecurity around them. This is an awful, awful thing for people to be put through. And they deserve clarity from the government. That's what they deserve. And that means an immigration system that actually works, that actually does allow people to come in who should come in and has some lines and is capable of enforcing those lines. And that's what we don't have. And we do need massive investment in immigration courts.
Yes, I completely agree with you.
Is just terribly underfunded. It's absolutely, it's nightmarish in terms of its ability to do what it's supposed to do. It's a bit like the audit section of the IRS. I mean, either do it or don't, but do it in this unbelievably half-assed and unfair way is awful. So I'm just thinking, do I think the public option is some kind of, let's say they come forward with a bill on that? Do I think that's just sort of a nightmarishly lefty thing? No, I don't. I think that's a lot of people will like that. I do think that if Biden understands that essentially economic leftism at some level is going to work politically for them, and if he restrains to some extent the lefty cultural stuff, then I think he has a pretty good chance of having a relatively successful term. My view is that in all across the West right now, parties that are economically tilted left and culturally tilted right are successes. Mm-hmm. That's what the Tories. Who knows what Boris is up to at this point? But that's what the Tories are trying to do.
That's a whole other podcast. That's a whole
other podcast. Yeah. But Dom leaving is not a good sign. I mean, it's no. And Boris's future, his reconstitution of British conservatism is very much on the line. That's another conversation, but it's factual. But there you have a situation which you might be more happy with, because there you have a government with a majority putting forward policies that it can be judged on in a few years' time, and we'll see if the same constituencies back it, if they're capable of holding those working class constituencies in a way that they haven't before, or if the old elite creeps back. Boris, who always likes to be loved and is part of that old elite more than anything else, decides, fuck it, I'll be mayor of London again and use that kind of politics. He's capable of doing anything. But we'll see what COVID does to all this, because that's the other. Yeah. But look, there's a possibility Biden gets in, doesn't do much except try and focus on the stimulus, which does have some green shit in it. You know what I mean? That has good infrastructure projects in it. And then you're going to get this burst of new demand in the economy as people come out of their shells. I think people are going to be partying like hell next summer. I mean, we're entering the roaring 20s.
Yeah. Andrew, quick thing. I was listening to your episode with Sam Harris to prep, and you called it debaucherous, which was much more fun than the sort of PG version you just gave us now.
Give us the R-rated, man.
So you need to go to the the carnival in Rio in 1919. That's where you need to go. You need to go there. And that's where shit was going. Oh, you have to look in the New York Times today. That little that picture of the sex club.
I saw that. Yeah, he busted some sex club in Queens.
Yeah, no, in some ways I'm like, well, that's enterprising. They're getting 70 people for a swingers sex club. I mean, this is what COVID will do to you. It's going to have a, I think it's going to have a disproportionate swing the other way. I mean, the truth is, you coop people up like this for months and months on end. I mean, let's face it, that's what a lot of this BLM insanity was this summer. It was a bunch of psychological letting off pressure. You're suddenly given this blanket permission to do the very opposite of what you've been told to do for the last 4 months. And not only that, but you get sort of a moral blessing for it. Of course, people are going to be out there.
Yeah.
So I think, I think it's going to be a really fun season in Provincetown next summer, and we'll see how many people show up.
So let's play with the sort of historical analog.
I should be more serious. Sorry.
No. Like this is sort of the purpose of a podcast. We're not trying to do Charlie Rose, R.I.P.
Yeah.
So
he's still alive. God bless him.
I was more referencing the career.
Ed, he still has to live. He's a human being.
Yeah. Well,
he has human rights.
Yeah, not disputing that. So if we sort of, I'm trying to pivot off of Charlie Rose splaining. So basically, things I wasn't prepped to do this morning. Great interviewer. That's what I'll say there. But if we sort of think of the whole, we could be entering of this like aggressive, open 20s. You came from the world of World War I and then the sort of Spanish flu pandemic. But then what you end up pivoting into is you have that 10-year period and we have the Great Depression and World War II, right? So we could have this 2020 period, which is really fun and great, but we have a really sort of terrible thing on the horizon. How do you think about that dynamic? Because I think that's the part that people miss from the whole, get ready for the super exciting 20s bit after all this part.
Yeah, we live in history. I think one of the things that was a little bit of delusion in the post-war period is that there was this period of enormous stability during the Cold War in terms of the West. In other words, the boundaries were clear, the ideology was clear, the prosperity was coming, and we kind of thought we were just still spectators of history. We could look at it, but it was kind of over. These big questions, we could talk about them. Will China rise? What about AI, all the rest of it. But the truth is we do live in history, and things like the Trump presidency is as dramatic a historical event as anything in America in the 20th century. I don't think anybody that crazy has ever been elected to the presidency before. There's a lot of other reasons for that happening, but nonetheless, that was really an extraordinary historical event that we may be still recovering from. Who knows? He could still be a huge factor in our politics for another 5 years.
I think that's going to happen. That's what I think is generally.
It's my nightmare, but yeah, he'll be around. And just because psychically he can't not be.
This kind of brings me to the last thing we wanted to get with you, Andrew, which is that the Trump era, all of that has been a bonanza for mainstream media. And I think a lot of people in media are kind of grappling with like, well, what the hell are we going to do now? I mean, ratings bonanza is
subscriptions,
gone. Subscriptions are, your own kind of career kind of typifies this. We're seeing this great bifurcation, which I actually think would happen at Vox is the perfect example. Like Matt Iglesias goes back to the blogging roots. He's on Substack. Ezra goes to the New York Times. But like everything in the middle is kind of gone. Like as somebody who's been and worked in this space for a long time, how do you think about that?
Well, it's been, I just happen to have lived.
You lived the whole curve, like the blog.
Whole curve from the beginning to the end. Seriously, it's been a fascinating experience for me because literally the first job I had in journalism as an intern was walking into the old Daily Telegraph building on the old Fleet Street.
Wow.
Which is the building that Evelyn Waugh describes in Scoop with Lord Copper. Actually, he was called something else by that time, but he still existed on the God knows what floor. I would write editorials on an electric typewriter with 2 blue ribbon carbon pages, so I get 3 copies, one of which would go to the editor, one of which would go to the owner. The type would be put in basically early 20th century cast iron printers underneath the actual newspaper itself. So the machines were whirring underneath you as you worked upstairs. They were guarded by this elite crew of incredibly well-paid craftsmen whose union had just completely. Anyway, I went from that to writing Substack that go out to 500,000 people read this stuff instantly, and I went through the whole process of the magazine era in the 90s, which was a pretty fun era, to the blogging era of the 2000s, then to the aggregation and blogging era of the late period, and then the Twitter takeover, which I kind of ducked in a way because I was blogging, and now the Substack era. Look, if I were in the MSM, I would be a little worried right now because you're losing your boogeyman. You're losing the villain in your. I mean, maybe not entirely, but definitely in terms of power.
Yes.
That narrative is gone. The energy that he gave to these wokies will also dissipate somewhat, although they will overcompensate by continuing to hyperventilate about these things. But you know what? The dirty little secret of woke journalism is that it's boring. It's that you can see the first sentence of a piece and know what it's going to tell you. In fact, it will tell you the same thing about everything. And what's happening at places like Slate or Vox, to some extent at the Atlantic, to some extent, well, certainly places like the old New Republic, the New Republic, it is just everything being put through the same strainer of critical theory and ending up the other end. And it's just unbelievably dull. And every piece reads like every other piece. And the notion of individual writers really trying shit out and experimenting and creating a different kind of voice, it's all gone. So I would not be that confident if I was invested in Vox at this point. I don't know what's going to happen at some of these magazines like New York or the Atlantic. I have great fondness for many of them, and I certainly don't want to see them collapse, but I do want to see them not degenerate into this woke drivel, which is just boring. I mean, that's the main thing, boring. Now, I don't know, from my point of view, and I've been surprised, to be honest with you, I was planning to do an Iglesias. I was planning to wait till the election and then make some nice noises and move on. Had to do it more quickly because they didn't really give me any choice. But 4 days notice, in fact. But it's been incredible. I mean, this is a better, more lucrative, more profitable, more stable platform than any I've ever had. And it keeps growing. I mean, since we started in July, it just keeps going up. We haven't lost a single person. And we keep, we're basically close to 90,000 people getting this every week. And then, of course, because it's out online, we also get more general traffic if the first piece is often free to people. So I don't sense any massive decline in my readership. I do sense a massive increase in the support I have in terms of financially and in terms of freedom. And personally, you don't realize until it's stopped, but the growing intense pressure on you as a writer not to freak out your editors because you freaked out Twitter, which is the dynamic that happens. They create this unbelievable wells, these waves of hostility and abuse. And in my case, they succeeded. They got rid of me.
Yeah.
They're incredibly pissed off that I'm doing better off outside than in. But that just makes me kind of, amused and happy. So I don't know what's going to happen. I have a feeling that a lot of these places that have gone down this easy woke route, which was something people wanted to read because they're straight out of college or they're young and millennials and they hate Trump, that may entirely begin to unravel. In which case, what's their business model? Yeah. Why are people reading them? Who are the writers they're going to stick around for? all the good writers get up and leave because they don't want to be constrained in the way they have. I mean, look, Matt Iglesias and Ezra founded Vox. Glenn Greenwald founded the Intercept. These are not marginal characters. These are the founders of these places, leaving behind essentially an army of rather mediocre millennials who have one argument and no others, which is tedious beyond imagining. So we'll see. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there is this great hunger for even more analyses of various forms of privilege. But, you know, I'm bored to tears by it.
Yeah.
So a couple thoughts. One, it's not a concern, but it's just sort of a dynamic, which is, and you're not saying this here, but I think sometimes people mistake op-ed pages for a broader sort of news organization. So I think what's clearly going to happen in the next 5 years, and you sort of pointed this out, is that in many ways, Substack, in terms of the folks who are publishing newsletters there, will have a much more interesting op-ed section, opinion analysis than anything at any major publisher. But that being said, that will present a problem on a business level, because at a certain point, what is good about a newspaper and what is good about the mainstream media is that you pay $15 for the New York Times a month, and then you get 20 people across a variety of aspects. So there is a sort of consumer side business problem here. And this works well for you because you've spent, 30 years building an audience, but this is terrible if you're sort of a smart up and comer. I still would not advise anyone to sort of skip taking a job in the MSM and then just open their Substack. It's not going to go too well. But a broader question I want to know what your thoughts are, because I think this is going to be a huge issue, is moderation on these big platforms like Substack. You're already seeing MailChimp say, we reserve the right to moderate the content, and not moderate, but sort of determine who is using our platform. Substack hasn't been aggressive about this, but the language is clearly there within the terms of service. How should these platforms think about this issue? Because I just want to say real quick, and this is something we run into by talking with our right audience, I don't think right audiences understand that to a certain degree, moderation or some quote unquote form of censorship is inherent to many of these platforms, given these sort of dynamics. It's easy to say we don't believe in censorship, but then Richard Spencer sets up the white nationalist meetup Substack, and he sells it for free. So your service is arguably subsidizing him, and you're faced with tough questions. So how do you think people running these platforms should be thinking about things, especially when much of their value add is, we're not going to edit you, Andrew?
It's a good and insoluble question, right? It's an unanswered question. I mean, it's a free country. I personally would favor maximal tolerance of viewpoints outside of threats of violence. The usual sane boundaries of what you don't do. You don't incite violence. You don't, if you're involved in doxing people or any of these obviously unethical things, then I think you can. But the content of your message, I'm sorry. I mean, you won't find a more hardcore defender of hate speech than me. When I say that, I mean, and I don't want that misquoted, a defender of the right to hate speech. I'm obviously not in favor of hate speech, and I wish people could understand that distinction, but it appears that an entire generation of students has no capacity to understand the fucking distinction between the right to be a bigot and being a bigot. I'm putting out a collection of my pieces next year, and one of them is an essay I did once called "What's So Bad About Hate?", which was an attempt to deconstruct this entire paradigm of, first of all, hate itself, which is this crude distortion of language of an incredibly complex spectrum of feelings and thoughts and ideas, to turn it into one completely indistinguishable blob and call it the worst name you can in order to chill discourse, and in order also not to help explain the varieties of discomfort, prejudice, bias, hatred. There are many different parts in which people are suspicious of each other and who have bigotries of various sorts. And some of them are relatively benign and so ineradicable from the human mind. And we should have that tolerance of it to some extent, because we're just humans, we're primates. And all the way down to hideous ideologies of white nationalism, or black nationalism or the racial polarization identification of everybody. So
Yeah.
A quick last thing here that I think will clarify. You're an editor, you're a writer. I completely understand the free speech. I'm saying you're a free speech absolutist, but I understand that ideological background. The problem, and once again, I want the people who are, we have a very tech audience, so I want the tech people who are sort of going through this question to think about this deeply. The problem that they would have is that it's one thing to say, I write on platforms, I participate in the discourse, I'm in the public square, we should be tolerant of viewpoints below violence and destruction. It's another thing, however, if you're a tech person and you're building the platforms that these sort of speech issues sort of come about, right? So it's one thing to say, look, I think Richard Spencer is reprehensible, but because he's not encouraging acts of violence, we shouldn't ban him from his ability to walk down the streets of Washington saying what he wants as long as he's following the law within a free speech perspective. It's another thing, however, to say, hey, I have a website hosting service. Richard Spencer is using my website hosting service. Should I allow him to do that? I've created Substack with this newsletter platform. We make it so that anyone can use a newsletter and we won't take any money from them because they're not charging. I feel as if people see that differently than the laws about sort of hate speech in public. It's a little different when you're the one who's building your form of the public square. So can you just sort of get at that dynamic?
Yeah, if you're a tech person, like involved in constructing these sites or managing them, sorry, but you have no role whatsoever in determining the editorial content of it. You're not part of that process. You're not a journalist. You're not an editor. You're a tech person. You shouldn't even be in the room when we discuss these questions. That would be my hard-ass response. And the idea that,
I just saw you kicking open the door at some product meeting.
Yeah. The PR people for tech companies listening to this are like, God damn it. You know?
No, it's just like, for fuck's sake. You're in the business of building websites. You're an expert in that part. It'd be like asking the people who printed the old magazines if they could control who was printed in them. No, you're just printing the bloody things. I'm sorry to burst your balloon, but no. And if you don't, go somewhere else. I mean, that's my feeling, is that one of the things that's happened is that editors in particular have surrendered their sole exclusive right to determine what's in their magazines, period. No one else has a right to determine that. That's what being an editor is. The idea that a tech person could challenge you is absolutely outrageous. The fact that these people have been allowed into that discussion at all suggests a collapse in editorial control.
Well, that's an interesting. Here's my question then. Because just the way it works, they have that control. I mean, are you like, who should be the superseding authority, right? Like, ultimately, it's about power. Right now, there's this contingent that has power, that is able to draw and bring to bear business resources in order to punish people for publishing viewpoints which are bad. I mean, it seems to me the only thing that's more powerful than concentrated capital, which is all in on that, is the government. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you want the government to step in and set up something like that.
What you need to have is whoever owns the thing, whoever's ultimately responsible for whatever platform it is, should be quite clear that there is an editor, if there is an editor, and that editor should be the only person who's ultimately responsible for what appears in it. And the idea that because you've helped build the technical capacity of a site means that you also have the right to determine what appears on it is abhorrent to any writer or journalist or editor. It's an absolute destruction of our entire function. Our function is to be able to say, even if I'm the only one in this company that thinks this should be published, it's going to be published.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent place to end this, just because this is an issue. Well, this is the most forward. Well, yeah, this is the most forward-looking part of this issue, and this clearly is going to be a recurring problem. And my concern, to speak to sort of tech audience once again last time here, is that the sort of thought process that you're going through, Andrew, isn't sort of going. I don't think there are editors who are in the room talking about these product decisions. I think these things are being put together rather ad hoc without any sort of deeper philosophical approach. So people really need to do that before you get the great moderation crisis of 2023. No one wants that.
We're probably going to have it. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
it's these are things that sometimes you just have to go through to get past. But the only thing I'm really emphasizing is the you know, in a liberal democracy really does give privileges to people who think and write, because a liberal democracy values those people and therefore gives them maximum freedom within their little bailiwick. The idea that people who just, I don't say just because it's a different skill, but it's a different skill, who build technically these sites, just as the old printers would print them, should have are absolutely irrelevant to the content that's going on. Absolutely irrelevant. And if I were an editor and someone from the print department came in and said, well, I don't like this piece, I'd be like, well, who the fuck cares? Like, so what? Don't read it. Or go work somewhere else. And we need a little bit more of that back. I'm tired of all these editors that have fucking, you know, office hours, as if journalists are like children. They have to come in and be supported, these all hands meeting, all this. For fuck's sake, edit your magazine and tell people who don't like it to go fuck themselves. That's you know, and then, or don't edit the magazine, then be thrown out at some point. That's what happened to me. That happened to most good editors in the past. But what makes a magazine itself is limited sensibility. It's a particular group of people, or a particular person who's editing, that creates individuality and distinction and distinctiveness between these different publications. That's why they all read the fucking same now, because they're not being edited by individual quirky but strong-minded and intelligent editors. They've lost their nerve. They've lost their nerve. And I think social media has helped them lose their nerve. I think some of the economic pressures has made them lose their nerve. I think the power of tech people has made them lose their nerve. If we want to protect liberal democracy, protecting the role of editors and writers is crucial. Not all societies believe in that, but ours does. And what I worry about with the younger generations, you know, their lack of familiarity with some basic concepts of liberalism and liberal democracy, is that we could lose this by accident. It's going to be really dull if it happens. And that's why I'm not going to, unlike you, I'm not going to tell your up-and-coming writer, don't do Substack, don't blog, don't. My advice would be do. Create your own sensibility. Learn. It's not going to start big. It's going to start really, really small. But learn from your readership. Evolve that way. Copy others. See what they're doing. I mean, the great loss is simply institutional ability to train people and to help them come along. I mean, there were countless people that I helped along the way when I was at the New Republic, in these other magazine roles. That's an incredibly important part that institutions do.
Yes.
And unfortunately, that's no longer happening because it requires hierarchies.
And I do just need to clarify, my position is not that you shouldn't do Substack. My position is that there's a parody version of this which says the mainstream media is dead. The New York Times is nothing. I can just pop up my little Substack stand and everything will just turn out peachy keen. It's about balance. And that's,
it's going to take a few years, bud.
What worries me is the New York Times is in danger of becoming this massive behemoth that soaks up all this talent and congeals it in one space and then conditions it to be super woke. Fucking terrifies me, the power of it. But I think the other thing about being a writer is that you don't mind being an underdog. You don't mind. I mean, it's hard. And social media has created it so that your ego is even more fragile because it's going to be really brutally battered, you know? So you're going to lose confidence in your own worldview. But you're often right and they're often wrong. Look at this election. Look at people... The people who were supposed to understand everything got everything wrong. or not everything, but a lot of stuff.
A lot, yeah.
A lot.
A statistically significant amount in terms that they might understand.
Nate Silver on that. But I have to say, I love Nate, and I think he's done a fantastic job, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm sorry. They misled me massively on this election.
Yeah, and I think that's...
And I feel I could have trusted my instincts more. You know, when I'm having those last-minute qualms about Kamala Harris's stupid-ass video about equity, when I'm just like, oh, Jesus Christ, I don't want to vote for them. A part of me was like, oh, Jesus, I already voted for these bastards. But then I knew, my brain kicked in, and I was like, no. But if I was having that thought, I've learned over the years to like say, well, listen to that, Sully. Maybe you're not the only one thinking that. I mean, this is what Mickey Kaus once said to me, is that, you know, you're told in journalism, never extrapolate from your own experience. Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes you should. Sometimes your natural response to something against all what you're supposed to think and say is actually what a lot of other people are feeling too. Don't dismiss it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Andrew, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining the Realignment. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm so Romery. I'd love to socially distant coffee or something.
Sure, absolutely, man. Of course. We all live in the same neighborhood. It's perfect.
Yeah, exactly. All right, guys. Bye.
All right, thank you, sir.